Racisme.
Racism.
Racisme.
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 Racisme raakt ons allemaal.
Men zegt wel eens dat Nederland het land is van openheid, tolerantie, gelijkheid en vrijheid.
Ik weet, dit racismegesprek voeren we al zo lang.
Het is ook een uitputtende strijd.
Maar ons verhaal en onze struggle wordt bijna niet gehoord en gedeeld.
Dus dat is ook een soort muur die eigenlijk constant wordt opgeworpen.
400 jaar kolonialisme heeft racisme een alledaagse en institutionele realiteit gemaakt.
Told me why don't you go back to your country?
Ja, dat je er eigenlijk niet mocht zijn.
Wij zijn mensen van vlees en bloed.
Ik heb recht om hier te zijn.
Het gebeurt te vaak dat we wegkijken en dat we niet iets ondernemen.
Stop met het onderscheid maken op basis van uiterlijk.
Say no to the discrimination.
Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Mohammed Ba. It is with a great delight and an immense pleasure that I'm sitting here with these wonderful people to have this panel. My name is Mohammed Ba. I am the founder and host of the City Right Radio and also the co-founder of the City Right app. Today we will talk about migration policies and racism. Migration restrictions mostly target poor, black, indigenous, and people of color, and are upholding global inequalities. What role can migration play in the fight for global equity and decolonisation? And what would happen if everybody would be free to migrate? For many of us, we know that going to any country in the world, you just need to take a few hours of flight. But unfortunately, for people of my kind, going to one country to another takes years, and a journey that could have been a matter of hours turned out to be a nightmare. And unfortunately, many people lose their lives, and there are many bodies in the silent graveyard of the Mediterranean or the cold borders of Europe. This discussion is organized by Migrate, a grassroots group fighting for freedom of movement and the abolishment of borders and discriminations based on nationality. And they are doing a wonderful job. Yeah. This program is part of an annual week against racism organized by the Pakhuis de Zwager and Comité 21 March between the 13th and the 18th of March. This is in the run-up to the annual demonstration against racism and discrimination, which will take place this Saturday at the Dam Square and is going to be one of the most wonderful protests. So please be there. I will be there, and a lot of people here will be there as well. We will first discuss what your migration policies currently are, and after a small break, we will debate on what anti-racist migration... Oh, sorry, the mic. My bad. We will discuss what anti-racist migration policies might look like, and at the end, there will be time for questions. So please, if you have a question, save it till the end, and if you don't ask any, I will be offended. Now, in many panels, there is always this culture of introducing guests, and we will revert from that. Each and every person on this panel will be given the opportunity to introduce themselves, to say as much as they can or as little as they wish. I'll start with Hidayah.
It's an honor to be here. It's always a very great privilege to be able to represent the undocumented people who I am part of. My name is Hidayah Nampima. I have been living in the Netherlands precisely for 5 years and 6 months now. I am a member of Amsterdam City Rights, and I am the co-founder. I am a very person who is very passionate about the lives of almost everybody. I became an activist because of the system, because of how we are treated, because we are not believed, because we do not really identify ourselves as undocumented people, but the system made us undocumented. One of the major things that I really focus on is to see that everybody is as inclusive as they can in the city and in Netherlands in general.
Thank you very much, Hidayah. And then we will move to the next person, my big brother, David.
All right, my name is David. Right, so I'm not a co-founder, I'm a member of Amsterdam City Right. Yeah, I've recently moved in from Ukraine, so and there as well I tried doing activism, but sadly it wasn't going so smooth because we know the type of country it is. As a black person, you're coming out on the street being like, we're being treated this way and that way, it's not nice. And then moving to the Netherlands where I'd expected things to go, so it's more smooth, right? So it's the Netherlands and more accepting countries. I'd realized I mean, if you compare it to like the Savage country, you could say it's the Netherlands is way better, but then I've realized we do have, or you guys have a lot of work to do. So, and then the journey of an activist continues. So that's what I'm doing with Hidayah and the rest of the coalition.
Thank you very much.
My name is Chris. Thank you for the invitation and for the organizers. I'm happy to be here and talk with you. I'm a writer, journalist, and an organizer, co-founder of Arales, a decolonial organization here in Amsterdam, and Arts of Resistance, basically bridging social movements in the arts. Yeah, I write about a lot of social justice topics, racism, colonialism. So the topic of tonight is part of that. So thank you for that.
It's really good to have you here. And we go to Nila.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Also, happy to be here. I'm Nilab. I'm a politician in Amsterdam, but also a social justice activist who just disagreed with everything that's happening from the system to the people for a very long time. And well, since not that much has changed, that's still what I'm doing. And also want to give a shout out to Migrate for doing absolutely God's work. So thank you for organizing.
Shout out to Migrate. And then we go to the last but not the least.
Hi,
Tina.
Thanks for inviting me here. My name is Tina Verliefde. I'm a photographer and a filmmaker, and I've done extensive research on how empathy works and why we don't have empathy for people who are at our borders. And that was the first part of my research, and the second part is why do we have empathy for some people and not for everybody. So also in the case of Ukraine, and I'm working on a new film about it, so yeah.
Thank you. These are our wonderful panelists today. It's wonderful to be here, and it's such an honor to be the one to moderate this panel. Now, to understand whether migration policies are racist, it is important to first dive into what migration policies are and what effect they do have on people, and people that are both on the move or people that live in human rights cities like Amsterdam. We'll start with a short video, but please, for those of you who are very sensitive to some content, if you don't want to see this, or if for those of you that are watching from home, if you're sensitive, please skip it.
Yeah, maybe I can add something to that. It's like especially for people who have traveled overseas, so migrated overseas. I think it could be triggering, so that's a very specific type. And maybe I can say something about the video. It's a short fragment of an installation that is very big, so you have to experience it in real life. And it's about the usage of water metaphors in the language and our policies at the water borders of Europe.
And we will play the video now.
The 23rd of February 2022. 3 people, names unknown, origin unknown, drowned when boat capsized off coast of Western Sahara on way to Canary Islands, Spain. 47 people rescued.
Beste mensen in Nederland. We worden overspoeld met asielzoekers. Overspoeld. Het is een invasie.
The 27th of February 2022. 35 people. Names unknown. Origin unknown. Drowned. Fiberglass boat capsized due to high waves off Sabratha, Libya, on the way to Italy.
Stop the flood. Swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean.
Massive refugee flows coming into our country.
Giftige cocktail.
The 27th of February 2022.
Thank you. That was not too graphic, hopefully for everyone. But Tina, can you tell us what we just watched? Can you tell us about it?
I was at the art academy. I was graduating, and when the fire in Moria happened, in Camp Moria in Greece, and I was really shocked because I really thought now we are going to evacuate the camp, because it was already 4 years known that the situation there was very horrible, and it was COVID, and I thought now it will end, but it didn't. It became even worse. So as a photographer, first I thought I have to go there to make photos of what the situation is, but then I realized that there are more than so many people died during our migration policy, and we have enough images, we have enough data, but those images don't touch us anymore. And I was thinking about it like, yeah, then maybe it doesn't make sense to make more images of the suffering itself, but think about why those images don't work anymore. So that's how my research on empathy started. And while I was doing that, I found out that one of the biggest enemies of empathy is dehumanization and fear. And it was very absurd to see that people are dehumanized by words that are actually a threat to them. So a lot of politicians use water metaphors or war metaphors or plague metaphors to talk about refugees. And when you talk about them as a natural disaster, it makes it easier for the general opinion to meet them with violence. And so that is where this work is really about how the language that we talk about people has an impact on how we treat them. And that is not a very abstract idea, that is real, and it causes deaths. And so, yeah, I decided to not show the images, but to open some space to think about these two mechanisms that, and to show, like, yeah, how we are manipulated in this, in how we perceive the other. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Nilab, I saw you reacting very interestingly. What do you think about the situation on the EU borders?
I also think it was a really interesting perspective, because the EU borders for the longest time have felt like something that was getting, it was like a stepping stone towards worse and worse policies. Because I remember that Moria at a certain time, made for 3,000 people, was hosting 30,000 people who were actually plagued by disease, people who couldn't reach any form of personal hygiene, mothers, children, etc. I think it was one of the worst things I've read about. I've read about the few doctors and psychologists who have been there, and they've described absolutely horrific circumstances. And it was also the thing that made me realize that the European Union is an institution that is not built on human rights and on policies that are meant to better the world. It's an imperialistic, neocolonial institution that shows its true colors at its borders, and especially in Camp Moria.
Wow. And I am a migrant. I'm so shocked by this. Anybody has some opinions to add on this specific topic? Chris?
Yeah, I think, as you rightly mentioned in your introduction, right, like a lot of us are used to traveling long distance by airplane. It only takes a few hours. The one thing I want to emphasize, because a lot of people don't realize this, the reason that people come with a boat is not because they cannot afford the airplane ticket. The airplane ticket is actually much cheaper than taking that boat travel. It's because it's made illegal for them to travel by airplane. So it's literally, Europe is creating the very situation in which people are drowning. So we're not talking about like, oh, we're not helping them. No, they're actually killing them. So these are border killings. They are not just border deaths. They are border killings.
Okay, so when we talk about things happening outside of the European borders, oh, sorry, the mic. When we talk about things happening at the EU borders, it feels very distant, and a lot of us feels like these are things that are happening from afar. But the same happens here where we live, and a lot of us, unfortunately, don't notice it. And yeah. Yeah?
Yeah, I can tell about the border violence. I think the situation at the borders is it made very complex, but it's very easy. We have still in our law, in our national treaties, that people have the right to ask for asylum. That is still there. But we make it impossible to do it in a safe way and in a legal way. And that is the situation at the borders. So they have the right to ask for asylum, but the way to exercise this right is super dangerous and very complex and very, as you said, very expensive. And all our resources go to the pure evil, to Frontex, to kill and torture them, and to smugglers. So we pay all the money and time we have. Oh yes, sorry, we have to. Oh, sorry, introduce the video. And so that is why that causes a lot of physical pain.
Yeah,
and I think
please, one moment. There is another video that can be played to give an insight of what we're talking about. But please also, if you are sensitive to graphic images, I think you should not watch this as well.
And this is part of my archive that I research images because I'm an image maker, and I look at what images are made at borders and that they don't touch us anymore and why that's happening. And so when we're talking about European border policy, it's not something very abstract. It's very physical. We physically prevent, harm people to cross borders. And I think that is very painful to see, but it is the truth at this moment of 4 years.
So many people don't get the opportunity to see this. I mean, this is mind-blowing, but these happen to people that are trying to seek safety. And Europe happens to be the pioneers of human rights, but this doesn't really fit to that description.
But maybe one really important add on this conversation is that the legal way to seek safety and refuge is to cross a border. You don't need to ask for permission. You're literally allowed to come to a border, which is exactly the thing that Europe is framing as illegal migration. But what they are doing is actually exactly what our policies and what our conventions say the legal way to ask for asylum is. So the whole framing of the context of illegal migration is in itself already a lie.
Yeah, it's a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
Interesting. Like I was saying earlier, if you think about all these things that are happening at the borders, you might feel like this is something happening very far and I cannot relate to it. But in the Netherlands, the asylum system is designed in a way to make people go away. And fortunately, we have some people that are asylum seekers, including I myself was one. Hidaya, you co-founded the Amsterdam City Rights and to fight for the rights of undocumented. What do you think people in the Netherlands, especially migrants, what are some of the discrimination that they face?
Right from the start, we are discriminated by the IND, by how we are grilled having an intense interview from 8 to 6, just to find if you are really fit enough to be given asylum. To me, I think this is really a very high form of discrimination. An undocumented person becomes undocumented after the system has pushed this person out of the system. What happens to you after you get undocumented? When you do not have the right to work. You do not have the right to seek any kind of financial help from anybody. you do not have the right to have a bank account because everything revolves around the BSN number. I have been living in the Netherlands for 5 years. I don't have a bank account, which I think I should have because, as you see, lately everything is very electronic. You cannot even pay money in the bus anymore with cash. You need to have a bank account. We are segregated from the politics. All the time, stakeholders who are having organizations that are pertaining regulations that are going to be governing undocumented people or refugees in the whole, they are talking about us, but without us, you don't know our problems. We need to be included in the policy making because you cannot say, this is what I need, yet you don't know my desires. We are discriminated in the healthcare system. We lost a member just a couple of years ago because the reception was asking so much. What's your name? What's your insurance number? What's all this kind of stuff? The health system should be educated about the CIACA. The CIACA pays for all the people who cannot have insurance, but they hardly have this information. We are discriminated in schools. Our children, our undocumented children, do not feel safe anymore to study. Why? Because after 18, nobody knows what's going to happen to you. Because after 18, probably you're going to end up like someone who has never gone to school. We are discriminated in the public transport simply because we do not have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Yeah, and these are things that are not happening outside of the EU borders. These are things that are happening in Amsterdam. David, you are also a member of the Amsterdam City Right. Yeah. And what are some of the problems that Amsterdam City Right, as an organization that fights for human rights and for the rights of undocumented people in Amsterdam, what are some of the changes that you fight for?
Right, so I mean, in general, we fight for equality. So we'll not just talk about undocumented people, right? So it's Amsterdam City Right is so like everyone have their rights. So when it comes to women, you know, like women rights, when it comes to gays' rights, when it comes to undocumented rights, black people's rights, that's just what we want. We want a city where everyone could feel comfortable, you know. So same thing Hidayah said, where people could have access to, where people could have access to like the simplest of things, you know. So the thing people who are born with a Dutch passport have, you know. So if I have a BSN, you don't even know like the struggle people without a BSN face. You don't know what struggle it is. I remember when I moved in with my wife, who was then pregnant, you know. So like it was a big struggle before I could be able to even prove to the IND we came from Ukraine, blah blah. We deserve to get registered. I remember like she was supposed to have a blood test, right? So like she's heavily pregnant. She was like 8 months. And then we go to the hospital. It was, I'm not gonna quote the name of the hospital. Anyways, we go to the hospital and then the woman's like, do you have an insurance? Why don't you have an insurance? Blah 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 blah. So it's always, you always have to go through questions where someone else could just go through the process and it's very easy for the person, but like because you're undocumented or like because you're being framed as a refugee, you know. So yeah, we fight for like equality in every single way. Like where people don't have rights, we're trying to make sure like every single person has access to health, education, to bank, and so on and so forth.
Well, yeah, this is some of the situation that a lot of migrants have to go through in the Netherlands. And it is stated that basic healthcare is guaranteed for everyone. But unfortunately, that's a different reality for us. So the question is, that's for anyone who wishes to answer, is the Netherlands violating the human rights of migrants?
I think yes, for sure.
No-brainer.
Yeah, but having studied law, even when you just look at the right to asylum, it is explained as a right that is guaranteed for everyone who has to fear persecution or who is in danger in their own country, regardless whether that country is the UK, the US, Russia, wherever. However, Holland uses safe countries to refuse asylum seekers who actually have something that they're fearing, even if it is war in that country. As soon as that stamp is used, people who are fleeing persecution and war have almost no possibility to be granted asylum here. And then often, because international law also says that if someone could be subjected to inhumane torture when they are returned, you can't expel them, so people become undocumented. Because the government knows that they cannot expel someone to a country where they would face torture, so they let them suffer in the streets with absolutely no guarantee to any form of humane conditions. So I think, yes, the government is more than aware of this, and they are upkeeping these policies for years, decades even.
I think the European cities, thank you for that wonderful answer. The European cities have overbranded themselves for a long time to be this perfect place, but under the radar, there is a lot going on, as you can see from this. Tina, you are working on a documentary that investigates empathy, like you said earlier, and the lack thereof. What role does empathy have in how our society reacts to migration?
Empathy has a empathy is seen often as like the solution of everything. If we have more empathy towards each other, then we will be nicer and then everything will be solved. But I think the more research I do, the more I understand that empathy is also cause of the problem. So empathy and xenophobia are always seen as two different sides of the very long scale, and one side is empathy and the other side is xenophobia, but they are like often the other side of the same coin. And I think that is also what we see often when we love somebody that is very close to us. We are also more aggressive towards if that somebody is hurt, and that is like almost the same mechanism. But I think what the problem with empathy is in our society is that empathy is a very important thing, and without that we would not survive as humans, but it's also a dangerous thing and not a good basis only to have a just society. So we need empathy as a start, but we need good laws, we need our minds, we need our principles, we need our cognitive side to increase the empathy that we feel for people who are close to us to a larger group of people to have a fair society. So I think that's maybe a little bit complex answer because it's a big topic, but I think empathy is very important, but it's not the end, it's only the start.
Well, I've always told people like empathy leads to change. I think I need to rethink that now. So
without empathy, we wouldn't care.
Yeah.
But with empathy alone, empathy is super biased. Empathy is very limited. You cannot have empathy for a large group of people. So you have to use the empathy that you feel for when we have a one-on-one conversation, or because it's really about having a equal leveling.
Does this answer to the question on why we don't have any homeless dogs, but a lot of homeless people in the street?
I think the Western person has a very strange relationship with animals in that sense. We have a lot of empathy, so that's why also my new movie is called Kitten or Refugee, because we have like so much empathy for kittens, but we let people easily suffer much more than we do it with kittens. But yeah, it is a difficult but super interesting concept. It is very emotional, it is very cognitive, and it has very good sides, but also very dangerous sides.
We can't wait to see that movie. I'm definitely going for the screening of that movie. This is an open question. Now, we understand all this, but why do you think, what is the objective, what are the goals of these deterrent policies? Why are they so? Because we are all human, and if we look at COVID, for instance, it started somewhere else, and all of a sudden it was everywhere. We breathe the same oxygen, we live in the same planet, we have the same issues, but for some reason, there are steps within steps that, push back. Why? Chris, you want to say something?
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to know where to start because there's multiple layers to it, I think. But one of the things I was already thinking when Hidayah was explaining about the racism, an example of where some of the first passports started, the first passport in the British Empire, started when there was a lot of expansion, sea travel, etc. British Empire was huge. They occupied a huge part of the planet. You know, the famous saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And a lot of Indian migrants started to go to white settler colonies like Canada. And white people basically started complaining and saying that that shouldn't be allowed. So it was very clearly about race. But the migration officers, basically, they had a problem because the ideology of the British Empire shouldn't be racist, because there was a lot of anti-colonial sentiment already back then, actually. We don't realize sometimes the kind of cultural racism or sneaky racism already existed back then. So they actually invented the passport as a means of blocking Indian migrants from coming without talking explicitly about race. So I think racism plays a big part. We also see it, for example, and I'm curious actually with your empathy research, I don't know if you touched, for example, on how different Ukrainian refugees are treated now compared to other refugees. And I think apart from the race issue, I think there's also another factor, which is war and geopolitics. Because even in the case of Ukraine, I think the war has already been going on for 8 years on a smaller scale, but there were plenty of refugees also from Donbass, and we didn't see the same kind of outcry. You see, if we go back further in time, you see the extreme difference between, for example, in the US, like refugees from Haiti, which are victims from American imperialism, and refugees from Cuba, who were, you know, generally speaking, mostly upper-class people who were close to the US-backed dictatorship of Batista, and they, you know, started the whole thing in Miami. You know, they were all welcome, but the boat refugees from Haiti, they weren't welcome. Yeah. So I think there's like the race issue, and there's the geopolitics, and then there's also the capitalism. And that's the last thing I'll mention, because I know I don't want to start a lecture. But
I think we should start a lecture, right?
But I do think it's an important issue, because people are not allowed to migrate freely, but capital is. In fact, if a government wants to limit the capacity of Dutch or Western corporations to enter their country, they're prepared to overthrow that government. A lot of governments have been overthrown for that reason. There has been a lot of effort put over the last 6 years, actually even the last hundreds of years, and we'll talk about that more later, to make capital go everywhere. And that's why you have the situation that basically you have this whole race to the bottom. Everybody needs to prevent capital flight, because if you don't, you know, slash all your labor rights, they'll just go somewhere else. And you get this unequal competition, because labor cannot go everywhere, but capital can just move around. So it's also a huge boon for big corporations, actually, that they can move freely, but the laborers can't.
That is very interesting, really. I still think, though, if the passport was made because of migrants, we should have rights to them, right? So nationality for every migrant in the Netherlands, please. We have...
Can I add something to, because what you said also with the difference between Ukraine and I think for the first part of my research, I really thought the Dutch asylum system is really fucked up, and that's why we have this problem, and that's why we saw those images. And I didn't really look at race, because I thought it's just like everyone who comes to Holland, we just keep them. And then, indeed, when the Ukraine war started, and we saw that we can be empathic and we can help people if we really want to, we can just change all those policies from one to another day. And how shameless the way it was shameless, also how colored black people from Ukraine couldn't enter, not only on the Polish border, but also in the Netherlands. When they arrived here, they were not taken serious enough. No. And that was for me also like when I really saw that this is really connected with each other. And why I think it's very unclear for a lot of people is that when we talk about migration, people use a different language. So with racism, we talk about color, but with migration, we talk about national security. And so we don't say like we don't want them because they have a different color, but we say they are terrorists, they are rapists, they are criminals, and that makes it very difficult to really pinpoint, and in combination with the passport and the country of origin. But because of this different language, we have now groups that are do advocacy for refugee rights, and we have groups that are anti-racism, but they don't see that, or they don't communicate like that is about the same thing, but it's just called differently when it comes to border policies. And I think that is important to see that this racism and xenophobia use the same kind of mechanisms, but they're just called differently.
Interesting. Unfortunately, we're going. I'm sorry. I know it is getting interesting, but we have to stick to the script. It is time for a pause. So this is really wonderful. We need to have more and more conversation like this. We need to have migrants present when talking about migration, because this is beautiful. I feel very honored to be here. We will take a 10-minute break, and then we will be back. For those of you who are watching us from home, go and get some popcorn or a cup of tea, and then we will be back in 10 minutes. Thank you, and see you in a bit. welcome back, everyone. Now we know a bit about discrimination and the violations of human rights of people on the move. Let's dive into racism, decolonization, and freedom of movement. David, let's be professional here, bro.
I'm sorry you were like, David.
What role do you think racism plays in Dutch migration policies?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think racism plays a role in only Dutch migration policies, right? It plays a role like in all of Europe. It plays a role like when we look at America, like, well, basically the Western countries, right? And I think racism plays the role of I look at racism as a door. You understand? So like, racism always brings the shut door. So like, when you're black, then the borders is being closed for you. There's zero tolerance, right? If you compared it, I mean, I might be going too fast, but then if you compared it to the Ukrainian situation, I've noticed the government always try to hide racism with tolerance. So how the media like welcomes, when we talk about the Ukrainian refugee, we don't call them refugee, we call them our visitors, our guests, blah, blah. And then when we talk about refugees from other countries, from Afghan, blah, blah, refugees. So if you look at it as a family situation, so like I'm a father, I have kids, and then I tell them, we're gonna have visitors coming tomorrow. My kids are gonna think, oh wait, we need to prepare, we need to clean the room, we need to cook good food because we want people that are welcome. And that's the same thing we saw like with the media telling the whole of Europe, European countries, we're having a visitor, we're having guests, you know, like you see the Ukrainian flag everywhere, you see people, so people like, you have, whenever people like the Dutch people, whenever they see, or like the European people, when they see like refugees, they always think, oh, these people are criminals, how can I receive this person in my house, blah, blah. But when the government tells them, okay, no, we're having visitors, you see like 1,000 people giving their house out for refugees, you know, like, oh, you could stay in my house for 6 months, you don't have to pay rent, blah, 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 blah. So that's one of the roles like racism plays. It either like it closed the door to like other people. So like if your hands like
Yeah, like I want to ask because nowadays you hear this time alert, real refugees and we are the fake refugees.
Yeah, I know.
So what is your opinion on this?
Yeah, I mean, especially like, so there's real refugees, there's fake refugees, there's real fake refugees. So that's, no, so like in the sense, like if you come, if you're not Ukrainian, but then you also fall under the Ukrainian policy, so you're kind of a real fake refugee because you kind of fall under the Ukrainian policy, but then you're not Ukrainian, you don't hold a Ukrainian passport. And then if you're just from anywhere like Afghan, blah, blah, then you're called a fake refugee. To be honest, I think it's all bullshit. Like refugees are refugees, right? Yeah.
I think we really need to understand the history of this. So I'll go to Chris for a second. Chris, what role do you think racism played in the creation of the policies we have today?
Okay, I touched on it a little bit. I gave the example of India, right?
I hope our guests at home have popcorn and tea ready.
I know, he needs too much.
Yeah, I think it's good to realize. So, like, I think the total percent of the world population right now that is a migrant, including like people who are not refugees, you know, people just outside of their country of birth, is about 3.6%. So we heard earlier in the video, like mass migration, floods of migration, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Do you know what is the largest diaspora community in the world? Do you know? Does anybody here know?
Afghans?
No, actually, the largest diaspora community in the world are Europeans. There are over 600 million Europeans and European descendants living outside of Europe. 600 million. Just by comparison, there are about 30 million Indian diaspora. And India has a population that's twice the size of Europe. So, you know, for a very long time, Europeans were traveling all over the world, and they were not coming to do like the hard labor, you know, building. No, they were coming to commit genocide, colonize. We're talking about 175 million victims in Abya Yala, better known as North and South America. where the Native Americans were exterminated. We talked earlier about India, like the famine policies there between 1880 and 1920 killed about 100 million people. We know from recent research. So we have that whole context. They are coming, I believe the British Isles, literally like more than 40% of the British Isles actually migrated between 1846 and 80 years after that. So we're talking about, it's not even like close to 3%. They were migrating, they were doing mass migration. Like Europeans were doing mass migration, and not in an innocent way. No, it only became a problem when then the people of color, the colonized people, the murdered people, the starving people, the poor people, when they started coming to the white countries, then suddenly it became a problem. And specifically because they were coming there before, but if they were not enslaved. Because if they were enslaved, of course, they were facilitating it. Indian migration, actually, when they were so-called contract labor to replace the enslaved population of Africans after the abolition of slavery, that was actually facilitated. They wanted to have more of that. But when free migrants started coming from colonized countries, then suddenly became a problem. Suddenly we get all these trying to restrict migration, and we get literal racist quota systems across the Western world. And what people actually don't know is that the Jewish population was on there too. And for that reason, a lot of Jews actually tried to flee from Germany, and they were refused entry in Western Europe and North America with a lot of the same arguments that are used today were used back then. Like, oh, we don't have enough money, they won't fit our culture, blah, 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 blah. It's very similar. So there's a long racist history. And the last thing I'll say about this, because I made the comparison with Nazi Germany, but it's actually more direct as well. Because Hitler actually, in Mein Kampf, he literally cites some of these racist migration quota from the US as an inspiration. And this whole idea of a flood of migrants and they're going to take over was very popular at the time. There was a book called, by Madison Grant, The Passing of the Great Race. And it argued that the great race, the white race, was going to pass because we get too many migrants coming in, migrants of color. And Hitler literally wrote, the author, and it's an American author, wrote a bestseller good book. Not a good book, obviously, but he had a lot of readers. And he literally wrote him, like, I read your book as my Bible. Like, this is not something that comes out of the blue. There's a long racist history connected to this, so yeah.
Wow. This is a lot to process, actually. I think there is a saying that says, insanity is doing something over and over and over and expecting a different result. And we as humans have gone very far. And unfortunately, we still keep repeating the same patterns, which is very, very bad. Hidayah, I'll go to you. What do you think anti-racist migration policies would look like?
Well, to begin with, I think the Western world wouldn't be thriving where it is without Africa.
No.
There's a lot that has been taken from Africa to see that the Western world is really what it is. And to be precise, nobody leaves home unless home is danger. Nobody leaves home unless home is a hyena. So with the migration policies that I would love to see, I would love to see that the way the Western world or the Europeans, Americans, and all other people, how they are really able to travel to all these countries freely should be the same that we see. The way we are treated, the way we are perceived, especially you have to be really prove that you are very credible for you to have asylum accepted. I believe we also have straight people here, and nobody asks you how straight you are before you could be admitted, like how the queer community is treated. You have to really prove that you are gay enough for you to have papers. The borders, for instance, the borders were created to stop migration. Migration did not start yesterday or 10 years ago. It started a couple of years ago. They are blocking people having stolen, having taken all the treasures of Africa. They have created war. Like when Afghanistan had catastrophe, there was no space for them to be taken in. But then when other countries had catastrophe, eventually space was created. So there should be a very favorable condition that is created for everybody, regardless of color, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. Everybody should be able to thrive in whatever conditions are available. So with the anti-migration policies, we would love to see that people can move freely, regardless of whether you have a red passport or not. You should be able to travel.
Thank you very much. Tina, you previously mentioned that there are different types of organizations that fight for the same thing but are not united.
Mike.
Oh. Yeah, who's Mike? Yeah, so what can the anti-racist movement do to connect with the struggle of undocumented people, for instance?
I think recognizing these patterns is already like one, that it's the same fight and working together. But I think also like how organizations are funded are separately. So like, for example, a lot of organizations that are focused on the borders and migrants are also really funded and really focused on just providing like first help at the borders, and I think it's good to advocate for the whole thing, like this racism at the borders, but also inside the country, because what you also say is it doesn't end at when you enter the country. So the border racism and violence is very physical, but when you enter the countries, it's very mental. You get what you said also about this interrogation and these interviews, but also not having the rights for basic needs. So I think working together would be really good and supporting each other. But also what you said about the laws, I think it's also important that we learn how these things are connected, so how racism and migration policies are connected, and we learn to kind of have a language to talk about it. Maybe that's not what you mean with like really concrete actions, but I think all these things are connected.
I think if someone has something more to say on that, please feel free. What can these different movements, anti-racist movement, do to like include undocumented people in their struggle? For instance, right now we have a lot of migrants that are migrating because of war, because of political issues, because of sexual orientation. But in the near future, chances are that there will be a lot more migrants because of climate change, for instance. And there are different organizations, different structures, different activist groups fighting for humans as a whole, but not united. What can we do to bring those people together? Because then we stand stronger.
I think one of the problems that we face is the issue of scarcity. People and organizations and activists, especially in a world that is ruled by imperialism, where people are divided and conquered, there's this perception that there is only enough for a small group. So you see that even within anti-racist movements, people are competing with each other. And I think that creates this sort of tunnel vision that makes people forget that truly being anti-racist is looking at people of color being treated outside of our borders. We are already the lucky ones, but if you look at Libya and our own prime minister going to Italy, I mean, Holland is supposed to be a tolerant country, so-called tolerancy, but then the Italian prime minister, Meloni, she campaigned with anti-migrant policies, anti-queer policies. She literally said that trans people and people who are queer are a danger to the Christian family. And our prime minister went there to create deals together with Italy, with African countries, to keep African migrants at the borders, and not in just any way, people in Libya are being tortured, they're being enslaved.
Yeah.
It is actually one of the worst places in the world. And we are not realizing that they are more connected to the struggle of anti-racism here than anyone else, because as long as people are kept in a situation that is close to being colonized almost, in countries that are being emptied and robbed, and they have nowhere to go because we profit off of their suffering, that is actually the anti-racist struggle that we should be fighting together. I think it's realizing that connecting those two struggles doesn't bring us any less justice, but it brings us more justice and equality.
Well, as you mentioned that's especially the fact that people are being enslaved while they're on the move. I think that is something that did not catch a lot of attention on the media, and I would really like people to look on that. Black people are being enslaved in the 21st century.
With European money,
Yeah.
with Dutch boats from a ship...
and Libyan Coast Guard.
Exactly, and the Libyan Coast Guard is using Dutch ships from Amsterdam.
It's good to know that Dutch ships. Nila, this is also a question for you. What role do you think, what role does neocolonialism and imperialism play in migration? And can you please also define the concepts for us?
Yes. Okay. So we all know what colonialism is. It was the robbing countries from all of their wealth, all of their minerals, and there was a belief that people of color were less worthy. We were less developed, and that's why it was justified to do that. In the end, we stopped with colonialist practices, but they continued as economic policies.
Yeah.
So people were not colonized directly, but they were kept in a state of economic colonization. And the imperialist core of how our world was divided was that white people basically decided that everyone of color was less worthy. So any country that was how do you call it? Where people of color lived could be robbed, emptied, people of color could be enslaved, they could be used for whatever kind of profit you wanted to make off them. And actually that never really changed, because we see that our migration policies, the visa policies, and also world trade is going in the exact same way. There was actually a really influential and inspiring African leader, Thomas Sankara, and he actually said in the 70s that even though countries were becoming independent, they were only becoming poorer. And he also predicted that in 30 years we would be even poorer, and the inequality in the world would be even larger than it was at that point. And our migration policies are based on this same concept of people of color not really being worth anything and it being okay to rob them. But in order to do that, they need to be in their own countries where they provide free and cheap labor. So you see that with Ukrainians, no one is talking about how much money it costs to host them here, how many people are moving into European countries. Neither are we doing this with what we call expats. These numbers are just not spoken of because these people are considered to be worthy of migration and of a fair life, while people who come from former colonized countries are still destined to a life of hardship. And that, I think, is rooted in the fact that we profit off of their suffering, because warfare is one of the most, the most profitable industries in the world. It is simply a way for governments to use taxpayer money and provide it to the weapon industry and the arms industry. So we're paying billions and billions to upkeep warfare and to keep wars as long as possible. So why would there be any logical reasoning for countries to then allow the refugees from those countries to come in here? And it's these colonial mindsets that are also justifying these policies. Maybe not directly. I don't think people actually directly think, I'm not going to let you in because, but it is a mindset that has never truly changed, because it is still the way that the world is divided and that trade and equality works.
Impressive. Thank you very much for answering that question. Chris, I now go to you again. What is your take on migration and decolonialism? Neocolonialism, my bad.
Okay, I had a different question in mind, but that's all good. I'll shift.
What was the question that you had in mind? If we forget that question, we will never forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
What was the question?
So on the sheet I got beforehand, it was imperialism, which is slightly broader, but of course it's related to neocolonialism.
But
so
let's go on. We can give a combination of both.
Right. So, as was just said, and well explained what colonialism was, of course neocolonialism was kind of the after phase, the informal phase of imperialism. Another major African leader, the first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, he actually wrote a book called Neocolonialism. He was shortly afterwards overthrown, actually, with CIA involvement. And he literally said that it was even worse. It was the worst form of colonialism because it was so sneaky, because you don't have the British flag or the French flag planted there. But if you enact policies that help the poor, that keep your country for yourself and not for foreign corporations, if you want to create your own trade and not just to provide raw materials for Western corporations and Western economies, it will become incredibly difficult for you. You'll get sanctions, you might even get invaded. So there is kind of formal legal independence, but there's no actual de facto, as they say, independence. Now, I guess my idea was to connect broadly with imperialism is to also mention the fact that neocolonialism isn't actually that new. Latin America has been in this situation for 200 years, actually. So we don't have to be surprised that this happened. They decolonized in the 1810s from the Spanish Empire, and then basically Britain took over. They owned almost everything there. The extermination of the indigenous peoples continued. In many cases, slavery continued. Afterwards, basically the US took over. I hope most of you know some of the basics in the 80s and the 70s. A lot of coups that were sponsored by the US government. So there's this whole long history, and for people who want to read, Eduardo Galeano, Open Fates of Latin America, has an excellent book on this. In the African context, I would recommend Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which goes in both the colonial and the neocolonial context.
We lived there, we experienced it. So
right, yeah, you don't need to if you want to know
it was very difficult.
Yeah. And even some countries, they experienced the neocolonial situation without ever being formally colonized. So and the best example probably is China, which was actually one of the wealthiest countries in the world before the British Opium Wars. Because basically what happened is that Britain was in India with, people starving on the plantations, basically, Indians making opium for them, but they wanted to sell them elsewhere. So they were selling opium, a lot of opium, to China. And they basically wanted to close the borders for opium, and they started a war to keep trading opium. And basically China, they called the century of humiliation, for 100 years, China became one of the poorest countries in the world. People don't actually realize this. If not the poorest countries. We don't know the exact data, but they were in the bottom 10, basically, before the revolution in 1949. We're talking about a major 5 to 7 major famines every 10 years. We're talking deaths that are so many, it's almost unimaginable. And interestingly, they were actually, if we couple it to migration, they were actually some of the first people targeted for the racist migration quota before it got expanded to other populations. So there's such a direct link between colonialism, imperialism, and migration. Yeah.
Can I add one thing?
Sure, please.
A really good example is when you look at how we talk about child labor, everyone is against it. And somehow in Congo, in many African countries, you see that child labor is happening on quite a big scale, especially in mining. And at the same time, who is buying the products from those mines? It's one policy that is really effective is keeping a country so poor that people have to risk their lives to get the products that you want to use. For the Green Revolution, lithium is one of the most important things we have. And many African leaders have actually been killed for trying to to ask for the right to development, to close their borders to foreign entities. But on the bright side, Zimbabwe has now said that they will no longer export, I think, lithium to the West. So you see that there have been shifts in the past, and now there's another shift coming where the rest of the world is seeing that these racist policies and these extraction policies should end somewhere. So we'll see about how far that goes.
Well, it's definitely going to be difficult. You just said they killed the first people that tried to stop it. So probably that's not going to work, but I think it should work.
But I'm not sure, because back then the West had all the power, and now that there's a bit more of a shift happening with China also becoming a bigger power in the world. So you never know. I think it could.
You never know.
You never know.
I think it can turn both ways, actually. So let's just keep our fingers crossed.
Just maybe as a hopeful note.
Yeah.
I mentioned Latin America before, which was decimated in the 80s with right-wing, semi-fascist dictatorships, mass killings of leftist people. But right now, Latin America has had a huge, huge leftist wave. I think about 90% of the economy, 90% of the population will be ruled by a leftist president. Actually, with the things happening now in Peru and Argentina, that might not be entirely correct, but it seemed to be like that for a moment when Lula was elected. But at the very least, it's very clearly that the left is very strong in Latin America, which for me is very inspiring because it shows, you know, you can torture as many people as you want, you can kill as many people as you want, you can disappear as many people as you want, but the spirit of freedom will not die so easily, and it will resurge.
Necessity is the mother of creation. I have a general question, and with this, all that is going on, all these important topics that we've discussed, should we just abolish borders and migration restrictions entirely?
God, yes. Please.
And how would that work?
I mean, all borders have been drawn up by the West. Most countries didn't even get a say in what their borders would be. And I think actually many people come from ethnic groups that just had plots of land that they lived on. I think abolishing borders would be the best way to allow people to govern themselves again, to create empathy in a different way from what we see now. It would allow the world to go back to its natural state where everyone has enough. I mean, the world does not have a shortage of food and housing. We create that through our border and nationalist policies. So if the nation state would not exist, I think racism would really not be there at a scale that we see it now, because people would have their own way of life freely in the world, and they wouldn't be governed by nation states that would benefit from keeping people out, profiting off the suffering of other people. I think everyone would have enough food. They could have houses, and they could make the best of what the world has to offer.
And for some reason, if a country decided to invade another, it would be invading itself. So it wouldn't make any sense.
Exactly.
True.
That's also.
Chris, I'm going back to you. What is the concept of freedom of movement, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's obvious, and you already said it. Like, people don't realize this, but nationalism is a quite recent thing. You know, it's a 19th century European invention, basically. Like, it's not natural at all. There was I was in a panel a few years ago with a friend of mine. She's also an Arles Chiro Geuzenbroek, and I thought she said it beautifully, that the borders are like scars on the earth. Like, migration is a very ancient practice, very, very ancient practice, fundamental freedom of humanity. It prevents tyranny because people can actually leave, and people don't realize it. But like, in ancient times, this was done also. A recent book that goes into this is also, it's quite famous actually, Dawn of Everything, from the recently passed David Graeber. But yeah, so this is what we've always done. And nomadic ways of life have also been, and I think this is also why borders were so important, because it's hard to control these people. Specifically for me personally, like my mother's Armenian and my ancestors come from Central Anatolia. And these people actually were targeted by the Ottoman Empire towards the end, once they got also more European influences of imperial policies. And one of the first things they did was to try to make them less nomadic, because they couldn't control them when they go back into the mountains in the Sahara and go back down. So a village where my great-grandfather was from is quite famous, also Zeytoun, as a place of resistance. And interestingly also was what you see is those nomadic communities often collaborated across ethnic and religious lines, even though the state was trying to create those divisions, right? This divide and rule policy. So yeah, no, I think like nomadism is it's what it means to be human also. Yeah. It's what it means to be free, and it doesn't mean that everybody has to travel, but that possibility has to be there. And even if you don't use it, it will help you be more free, because leaders have to be accountable if everybody can just leave. So yeah, I think it's fun, and even just the whole idea, like I don't see if you just walk across like. For example, in Armenia, if you go to Armenia, you go to Yerevan, you see our sacred mountain, Ararat, but you can't walk there.
Why?
Because there's a border, and it's a closed border. It's a border with Turkey. It's a very militarized border. You cannot. It's absurd. Like you see, literally Ararat, like all the creation stories of the Armenians are about the mountain. You can, and it's just the most unnatural. If you let a kid walk there. Does it make any sense to this kid? You know, this wall being there, it doesn't make any sense. It's something we created.
There's a lot of change that needs to happen, people, and unfortunately, we are way behind. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask what Hidayah thought of the question I answered.
You can ask her, please.
What was the question again?
The question is...
Not the free movement, but the one before. Should we abolish borders?
Yeah, I think borders should be abolished because, first of all, we are all humans, regardless of what your color is, regardless what your disability is. We can only create this by having visibility, because for a long period of time, undocumented people like myself have not been recognized. It's just in the recent years that we are given platform, that we are even talked about. So if we kind of have a sense of belonging for everybody, that everybody feels amicably welcome in the space that they live in, it will create a sense of belonging where you do not have to feel very inferior because of how you're being treated, but you feel you thrive in every society. So the sense of visibility, regardless of who you are, short, tall, color, and all this kind of stuff, this will make almost everything possible for undocumented people and migrants as well.
Yeah, and there will be no import and export taxes, so food will be way cheaper. Coming back to you, Nilab. Imagine we have freedom of movement. What will this do to neocolonial power structures?
I think, first of all, it would, as you just said, it would make everything cheaper, because one of the profit models of Europe and of America is that export and import taxes are used to to create impoverished nations. As Chris just said, that raw materials are being extracted from Africa. I watched a documentary about people picking cocoa beans, and many people in those countries have never even seen chocolate because it is illegal for them to create chocolate. They can only export raw cocoa beans, which cost barely anything. And then in Switzerland, we make a really expensive product of this. So I think if we would not have these policies that create this neocolonialist world, that food would be there for everyone. People would never have to fear that things are being stolen from them. And I think people would live with their own survival in mind, I think that the whole world would be a more equitable place, because I think many of us didn't really want to leave our countries. We were forced to. We came from countries with good weather, and instead, and good food. Instead, people are forced to migrate because neocolonialism steals the wealth of the world. So I think if we wouldn't have that, we would have a world where, first of all, racism wouldn't even exist. You wouldn't have to be insecure about your body because you're surrounded by people who are okay the way they are. I think it would be a world that would be so beautiful that we can't even begin to imagine, because we are so busy fighting these systems of oppressions that we have gotten so used to. But if people could flourish just exactly where they are, as who they are, I think we would have, I would want to say no worry in the world, but compared to now, probably no worry in the world. I think it would be a beautiful place.
Wonderful. I definitely think we should abolish borders. Guys, every time I speak, you smile. Okay, this is an open question for everybody. Please, David.
Right. So I was gonna speak about something, but I think the question got stolen from me by you. Yeah, so I was gonna talk about like the comparison, because recently I've been thinking about like the comparison between like Ukrainians, like actual Ukrainians. Oh, sorry guys. The comparison between like actual Ukrainians and like people like myself, like who come from like third world country, and like how the policy has been. Right, so I mean, in the very first start, it was you could come to the Europe regardless of your skin color, your nationality, blah 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 blah. And then when you come here, like it all started with your legal stay in Ukraine, right? Which I really do think is bullshit, right? I was trying to say it because I mean, like people. So it's just like if you imagine like how many undocumented people are in the Netherlands, and like kids who were born to undocumented parents and have been living in the Netherlands for like 18 years or like all their life and are still documented because their parents never had a Dutch nationality, and God forbid there's a war in the Netherlands, and then everyone has to run away. And then my friend is a Dutch person. I'm not documented, so I know my friend could go to another European country, and my friend is going to receive because she had a document. Although I had a house in Ukraine, although I had this and my life was going well, all I did not have was a passport, or all I did not have was a legal stay. But then I'm not going to be received because my legal stay wasn't there in Ukraine. Another policy is, so the Ukrainians get to stay like for 1 year, and then if you're like from another country, you get to stay 6 months, because the longer you stay in Europe, the poorer Europe gets. I don't understand the law. I don't get it. Then another policy, if we look at it, is if you hold a Ukrainian passport, then you could travel along Europe for 90 days. So you could, with a Ukrainian passport, under the Ukrainian policy, which another person, so like say someone from Ghana who also falls under the same policy as a Ukrainian person could actually travel to, say, Switzerland and stay there for 90 days. But a person from Ghana who also falls under this policy cannot travel, because if he goes there, same thing, is going to steal all the gold, is going to take things. I don't understand the law. Then I think another policy, sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. Jeez, I did forget it. Yeah, but yeah, so it was what I was saying about like limitations, you know, like the government tries to hide they try to hide the racism with limitations. So like, we're not going to be like open racist. We're not going to say, okay, no, we're not receiving these refugees. We're going to receive them, but then there's always going to be like limitation on like what they could do. So like, same thing, like Ukrainian refugees could work like 40 hours a week, they could work as much as they want, but then other refugees, they have like limitation of how much time they could work, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, that's just what I was going to say. Thanks.
But actually, one of the most important facts is that there's a World Migration Report that is made up each year by an international committee, which each year concludes that actually migration, even if it is a migration just to work, like what they call... No, not expats, but they call us gelukzoekers. Yeah, so the worst type of migrants, people from the global south coming to work, like absolute horror, is actually economically beneficial to both Europe and also the country that they come from. So actually there is, and if you look at this in the capitalist liberal way that they work, there's only benefit to be had. So there cannot be any other rule or logic behind this limitation but racism.
actually, even from a racist perspective, they're pretty stupid because there's actually quite some research done also that because the border policies are so strict, they didn't used to be this strict. Before, a lot of people would actually return to their country of origin because they never really wanted to only live here. Yeah. But if you make the policy of going back and forth impossible, then people are like, yeah, I'm not going to take the risk, you know, I have a little bit of more security here, I build up something here, and then I can send money back home, and then a lot of people stayed. Actually, the remigration rate dropped extremely. This happened in Europe, but it also happened in the US. So even if you're a racist and you want like less people of color here, it doesn't make sense. So xenophobia is not necessarily a rational thing, but yeah.
Yeah, it's really based on fear. And I think what you also say is it works two sides, because you otherize the people and don't allow them to join and to become insiders. You treat them as outsiders. And the Ukrainian people who are treated as insiders, they become also easier insiders because they get the opportunity to work, to go to school, to have a normal life. And with a lot of migrants, refugees of color, we torture them on the way to here, and then we let them wait for years in insecurity, and these waiting years are extra traumatizing, and we don't let them work, and then they say, oh look, they're different, they're behaving different, and they're not joining, and they're not working. Of course, because that is the whole policy is about. So it kind of reinforces each other, and you don't allow them to become insiders, and then that proves again that they are different while the treatment is different.
The worst thing is that actually the countries, I think the Netherlands, Denmark, a few countries that say that the multicultural idea has failed are all the countries that have never had policies that could allow for integration. So they, from the start, had racist policies that only forced people to do tests and exams that they could never pass. And then they were like, oh, multiculturalism has failed. So basically countries that have never even tried helping people integrate are already referring to the racist ideology behind it to then legitimize that they don't want to let people inside anymore.
Wonderful humans. Thank you very much for these wonderful contributions. And I think now we have to go to the public if you have any question. I don't know if this will continue with the live stream. The live stream will stop. Okay. Yeah. And so. Because we don't have a mic for the questions, so they cannot follow the question session. All right. So for those. So there is. We unfortunately have only 5 mics, and the question part of this program will be limited to only those who were present. So enjoy your popcorn and tea. Thank you for attending this event organized by Pakhuis de Zwager.
Or we repeat.
Like the person could come forward.
Yeah,
and then
but they have to. Yeah. So. Yeah. This David, professional. Please. This is organized by the Pakhuis de Zwager Samen tegen Racism. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And Migrate, which is a grassroots organization that is doing a wonderful job. Please, a round of applause for them. This is so nice. We saw what they did during the Ter Apel situation. There was a lot of people that were in dire situation, and they helped really, and that was amazing. So a round of applause for them again. There will be another program if you're watching from home tomorrow at Pakhuis de Zwager. You can reserve and be there in person, and definitely see you at the protest on Saturday. It will be at the Dam Square, and it will be at 2 p.m. And thank you very much. Bye-bye. Now we stick to you guys. So, what's up? Question?